We're going to be talking about time lapses and mysterious vanishings and people turning up elsewhere. And I also want to talk about the idea of doppelgangers. That's what I want to talk about tonight for the next 45 minutes. Where we are is near the Albert Bridge, which is in southwest London, and it also goes north of the river as well. So that's where we're going to be walking today, over Albert Bridge and around Battersea Park, because it's nice and spooky. Okay, so let's turn us around and explain exactly where we are and what we're going to be talking about tonight. So there are a few subjects that I wanted to talk about and a few incidences of each of them. We'll see what we can get through. I probably prepared more material than we need, but the three subjects really are people's belief in the possibility of time travel, and also maybe specifically time lapses, and then mysterious vanishings, and the third, that's more about doppelgangers. The idea for the tour, it came from a who mentioned a couple of times that she had met her doppelganger, so then it kind of intrigued me, so I researched it. This area is kind of perfect for talking about something like that, because something happened to me this time last year. Something weird. I can't really explain it. It's probably a coincidence, but for a couple of days it did unnerve me a little bit. And you might hear it later and think, that's strange. If you're going to be dipping in and out of the tour, by the way, do please watch for the last 10 minutes for that story, because it should be quite fun. We're just down the road from a place called Belgravia, which is one of the most affluent parts of central London, and it's a notorious site of a murder and an apparent disappearance that happened nearly 50 years ago. The murderer was a man named Richard John Bingham, but we would know him better today as the 7th Earl of Lucan, or as we know him, the short title, Lord Lucan. He was born in the 1930s. He had a rich family. He was well off, but as can happen when everything's handed to you on a plate, he fell into bad habits. He developed a gambling addiction. He left a very good bank job when he was around 26 to become a professional gambler. And when he was the age of 30, he inherited the title of Lord Lucan. He drove an Aston Martin, he raced powerboats, and by 1972, he was 36. He was drinking, overspending, had huge gambling debts, and was going through a custody battle with his wife, his estranged wife, Veronica, or Lady Lucan. And they had 3 children. He included, the problems included him stalking her, recording phone calls. He employed private detectives. And then on the night of November the 7th, 1974, the unthinkable happened. An intruder enters Lady Lucan's home on Belgrave Street, just down the road from here. Sandra Rivert, the family's nanny, was there at the time, and Sandra was murdered. And then Lady Lucan herself, who was there at the time, she came under attack, and she realised her assailant was her husband. She managed to escape. She ran down to a nearby pub. It was called the Plumber's Arms, and she just screamed in, help, help, murder, murder. So November the 7th, it was Sandra Rivert's day off, and the theory was that Lucan expected her to be away, and he had removed the basement bulb from the light, and we think that possibly he mistook the nanny for his wife and attacked her. And then we know what happened to him for a bit. He went off 42 miles to a friend's house in Sussex, and he posted a couple of letters saying he had had a terrible traumatic experience, a night of unbelievable coincidence, when he just happened to be walking past his ex-wife's house and he witnessed somebody run out who had attacked his wife and the nanny. His car was later found in a place called New Haven on the coast, and it contained a few bloodstains, and it contained a length of metal pipe which had bloodstains on it as well. So he then went on the run, it seems. In the car, he left all his personal effects. He left his wallet, his keys, his driver's license, his passport. And the next year, a year later, he still hadn't been found, and a coroner's inquest said it was homicide and named Lucan as the perpetrator. And it had been the first time since the 1700s that a member of the House of Lords had been accused or named as a murderer. So the mystery starts. Where did he go? To this day, we don't know. He had a friend, John Aspinall, who was a casino owner and a zoo owner, and apparently he owed him loads of money. Some people think Aspinall found him, suggested to him, I will help you, and then had him kidnapped. Some people say he was fed to the tigers at his zoo. A lot of people think that he just left the country. He has been seen all over the world. Australia is probably the most likely place that he could have gone if he went anywhere. Now he would be 85. The son of Sandra Rivert has spent years trying to find where he is. He thinks he has evidence. He thinks that Lucan would be about 85, 86 now, and he has found photographs of him residing in a Buddhist commune in Australia. By the way, we're coming up onto Albert Bridge. These are old toll booths, so you used to have to pay money to get onto the bridge. And there's a warning here, it says troops must break step. They call this bridge the Trembling Lady, and it's like the Millennium Footbridge between the Tate Modern and St Paul's Cathedral. It did wobble for a bit, so they would say if soldiers were going to march over this, they shouldn't march together because it will make the bridge sway a bit more. So the idea of hundreds of people apparently seeing Lucan over the years in different parts of the world, it brings up this subject of doppelgangers. Now, doppelgangers, it's based on a German word, Doppelganger, meaning double goer or double walker. And it involves a possibility that there is someone like you. Not a twin, but someone like you, who looks like you, exactly like you, somewhere in the world. Maybe there is more than one. Maybe there are many people. The fact is that seeing someone who is exactly like us, although they're not related, it must be a strange thing. When somebody else says it, I saw somebody that looked like you don't have this feeling. You just go, oh well. But when you're confronted with someone who resembles you in every way, it feels, or it must feel, like you're having an out-of-body experience. I say this, but I've never seen my own doppelganger. Part of me wants to. Part of me wants to know how that feels. There was a German writer, von Goethe, and he said in the 1800s he was riding on a horse along a footpath, and he saw a person who looked like him riding past, but in very expensive clothes. 8 years later, he was riding in the opposite direction, and he saw the original version of himself riding past, and he realised he was wearing the expensive clothes that he saw on the man 8 years previously. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story called William Wilson about a boy at school who sees another boy exactly like him, but a slightly dishevelled version, and he begins to hate him. The doppelganger starts giving him advice, which he ignores. And then my favourite bit about it, the doppelganger is there throughout his adult life as well. And when the real William Wilson wants to court a lady and ask her for a date, the doppelganger says, no, you're not going to do that. And it's like all of his better instincts, the doppelganger, William Wilson, says, you shouldn't do that. And he eventually gets completely fed up with him, and it escalates pretty badly, and then they have a fight, and the real William Wilson stabs and murders the doppelganger, and then he looks in the mirror, and in the mirror it's just him, and his own body is covered in stab marks and blood. That's Edgar Allan Poe for you. Anyway, let's take you back to me now. Okay, so you can probably hear maybe the rumbling of the cars on the bridge. They call this the Trembling Lady. You hear that? It's a strange old bridge, really. It's safe when you walk over it, but like a few bridges in town, they seem quite thin when you drive over them. So they have these marks on either side. You can see right behind me these barriers where they can only allow certain weights and certain widths of traffic through. So there are some people that think when you see a doppelganger, you're either seeing an alternate version of yourself, that they popped into your dimension or you popped into theirs, or that it's you in the future. Some people believe that you're simply seeing somebody exactly like you, and if you see that person 3 times, then you'll die. Some cultures believe that seeing a black cat is good luck. Some people believe that it's bad luck. But what I'm asking is, I don't know if any of you have ever felt weird when somebody has told you that a friend or family member, that they definitely saw you somewhere and you weren't there, and they're convinced and they won't take no for an answer. That happened to me about a year ago, and it's something I want to talk about at the end, this little story. But there's a few other little stories related to what we would call timeslips. One of the first timeslip stories that I read about was, it was a series of events that became known as the Doddleston Messages, and they were to do with a man called Ken Webster, and he had bought a cottage in 18th century, a cottage from the 1700s outside London. He bought it in the 1980s, and it was an account of him receiving weird messages on a computer. He was a teacher at a school, so I'm saying mid-80s, home computers. The most popular one in the UK was called the BBC Micro. So if you can imagine black screen and green writing. He didn't have his own computer, he'd have to go to the school to use one. Eventually the school let him borrow one, so he could work at home. Emails were around, an early version, and people, I suppose if the computer was plugged in just through the phone line, they would just get messages popping up on the screen. And Ken started getting messages in the evenings from somebody called Lucas, Lukas. And Lucas started to send really cryptic messages, and they seemed to be typed in a stranger, an older version of English, and Ken couldn't ignore them. He asked Lucas who he was. Lucas said he lived in the year 1546. Ken gets a bit freaked out, and Ken says, "Tell me a bit more about yourself." And Lucas says, "You have stolen my house." The messages carry on for about 18 months. Not many of them. They're appearing every month or two, just random messages. But he gets to know about this guy Lucas, or apparently this guy Lucas. He questions him about who the king was at the time, what college he went to, where he studied, and it could all be a prank, the whole thing. But the really interesting thing about Doddleston and these messages, I suppose it's unexplained to this day. The messages seem to refer to things that were happening inside the house, that unless you were inside the house you wouldn't know about. Lucas sent a message one night, and he was referring to a photograph of a car that Ken had taken, and he had left the photograph next to the computer, and Ken lived on his own. And Lucas said, "I found the picture of your cart," not car, cart, and he said, "Without a horse it won't go far." So it's a photo that only somebody would know about if they were inside the house. Another weird message happens. When Ken says he's living in the year 1985, Lucas says, "Who is your friend living in the year 2109, 2109, who has just bought the box of lights?" The end of the story, well, Ken said that he just moved. He gave the computer back to the school. So it wasn't really a proper ending, a lot of these tales. Let's talk a bit about time travel. The first mention of it in fiction was in the 1880s. Mark Twain wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. That was 1889. The idea of, I suppose, something happening beyond your control. In Mark Twain's case, somebody is just knocked on the head and they wake up in medieval England, and this guy is seen to be a magician. He teaches people modern English, he sets up factories, they produce weapons and armour, and it's more a social story than anything else. In a way, he's kind of freeing people from their old medieval ways. It's a great read. If you haven't read it, it's like all of Twain's work, really. But even though it involved somebody going back in time as a story, it was, I suppose, a comment on the Industrial Revolution, social issues in America. Not really, I suppose, science fiction. That all began with H.G. Wells. He wrote a story called The Chronic Argonauts in 1888. If somebody manages to go back in time, uses a machine to go back in time to kill the previous owners of a house so he can buy it cheaply in the present. And then 7 years later, 1895, he wrote The Time Machine. The Time Machine's generally seen to be the first novel that uses time travel as the main story device, and it's a scientist in Richmond, again just down the road from here really. He's telling guests at a dinner party that time is just another dimension and it's possible to go back and forth through it. So since the late 1800s, storytellers have loved this idea of time slips or time travel as a plot device. Let's imagine, I'm not saying we should believe it, but let's just imagine they're not just in a writer's imagination. What if there are places on the planet that have supposedly more instances of people slipping back to another moment in time? One of the most famous places is Bold Street, B-O-L-D, in Liverpool. So it's a nice area now. Bohemian, independent stores, cafes, shops. But there are quite a few documented cases about people that have just walked along the street or turned a corner and suddenly just randomly found themselves in another decade. One of them happened in 96. There's a man called Frank. He was a police officer. He was off duty. He went shopping with his wife in the Bold Street area, and the couple decided to split off. So Carol went to a bookshop, which was called Dylan's, and Frank headed to a music store, which was called HMV. So Frank and Carol separate along Bold Street. After a few minutes, Frank ran into an old friend. This is what he said afterwards. They chatted for a few minutes, then he went off to the music store, then he made his way back to Dylan's. And he said he was walking along the pedestrianised road. No cars are allowed on it. And suddenly, he said that all the bustle of the area just went away and it started to feel really empty. And for a Saturday afternoon, it felt really strange. Then he heard honking, the hooting, the beeping of a vehicle behind him. And when he looked round, he said there was a small 1950s style, what they used to call a box van, and it had the name Cardins printed on the side, and it just whizzed past him. And the first thing he said was that he was annoyed because this was a van driving fast in a pedestrian area, a walking area. And then he looked down at his feet, and when he looked down, he said that the pavement was different. It was sort of more cobbled than anything. And he realised that he was standing in the middle of an actual street and there were vehicles going down or up and down either side of him. And then he looked up. He wanted to see Dylan's bookshop. He said he was in the right place, but the sign above the door didn't say Dylan's, it said Cripps. And he felt that something was wrong. He said that all the cars were from the 1950s. The men were dressed up, they had hats, the women were in long skirts. And he went up to the window of what he thought was the bookshop, and instead of seeing bookcases and tables with books, he saw handbags, he saw shoes, umbrellas. And then he turned around and everything seemed to be back to normal. What it turns out is that Cripps was actually a store that existed there, and it sold women's clothing, and that was prior to it being Dylan's bookshop. And Cardin's was also a well-known firm in the 50s that did have box fans like Frank saw. In 2011, there was a woman that decided to visit Bold Street to do shopping for her niece. Niece had just been born, and the woman hadn't lived in the area for a while, but she was staying with her mother. And she went into Bold Street and she saw that a new Mothercare store had opened. Mothercare was a children's clothes and toy store, and it had opened on a corner of Bold Street. So she went inside and she browsed around a bit, selected a load of things for the baby, and later on she said that she was surprised how cheap they were. And she thought maybe there was a sale on because the store had just opened. And she brought the items to the counter and she took out her credit card, and the sales clerk or the manager or whoever was there, Imogen, this lady, said that she was very nice, but they didn't take cards as payment, they only took cash. And she didn't have the cash, so she left the store. She said she'd come back another time, and she got home and she told her mother about what had happened, and the mother seemed really confused and said, yeah, there was a Mothercare store there, but that closed about 10 years before. There's a bank there now. And Imogen didn't believe her, and so the next day they went back to the same area, and sure enough there was a bank. So that was, if it's real, that was a time slip of only a few years rather than going back to the 1950s, as a lot of them seem to be. There was a woman in the 80s that said she was in a cafe and she was looking out on the street and all seemed lovely, lovely sunny day, and then suddenly the sky went dark, like a big cloud had come over, and she said that everyone was replaced with 1950 style clothing. And then she looked back inside the cafe and the interior of that was different as well, and sat next to her was a man in a vintage suit. And then she looked back out the window and things were back to normal. There's a weird little story about a security guard, and it happened, I think it was around 2001. And he was chasing a shoplifter around the corner, and he wrote it in his notes that the corner he went round led to a dead-end street, and as he came round the corner, it seemed like the shoplifter had just literally vanished. And a few months later, by coincidence, he caught the same shoplifter. Same guard, same shoplifter. And he said, what happened to you when I ran round the corner, you had gone. Where did you get off to? And the shoplifter said to him, yeah, that was weird. When I ran round the corner, I thought you were right behind me. And then you never turned up. What I find interesting about all of this, and I'm not saying these things exist or don't exist, but these stories seem to stop in the early 2000s. Really, when people started to get into social media and they get into smartphones, there seems to be a lot fewer of these stories. So either it could be that our lives are just too busy, we're not looking up enough, we don't have that time anymore just to be still and look around us. There's always something that occupies our time. When we're on a train, we're always looking at a phone. Most people are anyway. And it could also be that with the advent of social media, people are a bit more opinionated, they're a bit more cynical. And there was probably a point in the 80s and 90s when if these things did happen to you, or you felt that they happened to you, you could say it to people and you might not be ridiculed, whereas people can be quite quick to jump on you for saying something. They would kind of dismiss it as nonsense straight away. So I think people are a bit more guarded with saying something like that, but in the same way, people are a lot more opinionated. So maybe it's why it stopped. But if these things exist, let's say that every single one of us here believes time slips exist, then why doesn't anyone appear in a photograph from the 1920s in a Guns N' Roses t-shirt? You know, there are a few photos that seem to be of that type. People wearing slightly more modern clothes, but years before. But nothing really specific, nothing like a band name or any recognisable design. There are a few photos from London that are from around 100 years ago with women, two of them that I know of women holding up what look to be cell phones or mobile phones to their ears. Now, time travel, time slips, you know, they're two things that we're talking about. But I reckon this is where belief is stretched a little bit too far. For two reasons. One, who are they speaking to? And two, the main one, I know from doing these tours since December of last year, it's difficult enough to get a signal on a Hago tour in London. Never mind 100 years ago. If these guys have got a signal, what network are they on? Do they get free minutes? Do they get free texts? What's the data plan like? Do they have a Zoom feature? Do they have a chat? Do they have their location on? Too many questions. Both of those photographs that I mentioned, they are, one of them's definitely quite easy to find, and it looks like a woman's holding a cell phone. But I think what it actually is, it seems to be an early version of some kind of hearing device. So maybe that's what it is. Not maybe, I think almost definitely. Now, when I was researching this, little bits and pieces about Mark Twain and things on Bold Street and the Lord Lucan stuff, I thought I would quite like to tell stories that have happened to me or happened to other people, but they refer to me, and they're things that I can't explain. They might have meaning behind them. There might just be a simple explanation, but they're just weird little things that I thought, oh, let's say a few of my weird little experiences. In a bit, by the way, I'm going to tell a story about Anthony Hopkins, which is quite a good coincidence story, which I read about. I could also tell you, but we probably don't have time, we might on another tour, about apparently in Brompton Cemetery there's a mausoleum, a big tomb, and there's a door, a gate, a big stone gated door, and apparently, I only read this morning, that they haven't found the key to it for about 120 years, and a lot of people think it's a portal to another time, but it looks like for 120 years nobody has seemed to try it out. But I wanted to talk about a few of my stories, so I thought, what can we do? Well, we'll do 3 of them. The first one is involving a bike, my bike, which I lost about 15 years ago. So the circumstances around losing it, they were annoying, but I've kind of worked out that it was possibly my fault why it was taken. That I maybe just didn't chain up properly. It's the circumstances about finding it again 5 years after that were the really curious part, a real coincidence. So, I'm going to set the scene, and sorry if this is long-winded. I was acting in a play on tour, and if you haven't met me before, I've been an actor about 25 years, so every now and then you get to do a little play, and sometimes you get to go on tour. And on this occasion, the show was called Arsenic and Old Lace, old American play, and we were travelling to different towns in England. And when you get these little jobs, you get the chance to stay at places you might not normally visit, and even if you do get to visit, you only go for a day, but you get to stay for a week. So what I like to do is, unlike the rest of the cast and crew, a lot of them just get trains from place to place to place. They live this kind of nomadic lifestyle. I like to get home. I'm quite a homely guy, so I like to drive home on the Saturday night and then have the Sunday off at home, and then on the Monday morning I'll drive to the new location. I always bring a bike with me and I put it in the car, and it also means that I can stay a bit outside the main town centre, so I pay less for accommodation. The theatre companies often give you subsistence for accommodation, and if you're staying a little bit outside, you end up using less of that money anyway. So they give you a kind of per diem. They give you money per day to help with accommodation, and you get some exercise. So anyway, we were in Guildford, just outside London, and the company were paying for the accommodation. I thought I might as well do what I normally do. I'll stay there, I'll cycle back to my car on the Saturday night and then go home. So on the final night, again, one of my routines, if you've got about 10 minutes off before the final bow, I normally rush back to the dressing room and I shove everything in my backpack so that when you've bowed, when you've left the theatre, you can just literally get straight on the bike, go back to the car, and sometimes you're home before midnight. That Saturday night, 15 years ago, my bike had been stolen. I chained it outside a restaurant which I don't even know if they have them anymore. It was called Garfunkel's. Garfunkel's restaurant, just down the road from the theatre near the train station. nice bright area, I thought. And the lock was gone as well. So not only had they taken the bike, they had taken the lock. It was one of those keypad locks, you know, the ones with 4 numbers. So loads of different combinations. Anyway, both had gone. I was really annoyed. I got a cab back to my car and I drove home and sort of said goodbye in my mind to the bike. Now, 5 years later, I got another tour. Different play, different route around the country, but one of the stops, again, was in Guildford. And this time, I just decided I would get the train there and back home. It took a lot longer, but this time they weren't paying for the accommodation, so I thought I'll just go home every single day. And I noticed in those 5 years they had done up the town centre, especially around outside the train station. This Garfunkel's that I had chained my bike outside before, that was gone. It was a completely different cafe, restaurant area. But the last night, the Saturday night, I did my usual routine, packed up my stuff from the dressing room, took the final bow. After the curtain call, what most people do is just they run off to the backstage crew who were taking the set apart, ready to take it to the next venue. And I ran on stage and I said, guys, I'll see you later. Have a good night. Don't work too hard. And I'll see you on Monday. And they had the radio on, and the song that was playing on the radio was Bright Eyes by Art Garfunkel. And it reminded me of what happened 5 years before. And I just said, ugh, Garfunkel's. This reminds me of when I was here 5 years ago. My bike was stolen outside Garfunkel's. And they were saying, yeah, it's all gone now, isn't it? I said, yeah, thank God, I don't want to be reminded of it. Now, I went to the station. I missed my train by about 2 minutes, so I had about half an hour to wait. And the next one was going to Clapham Junction. It's going to take about 45 minutes for the train. So what I thought I'd do is I went to get a coffee and a sandwich at one of the shops just outside the station. And as I came back out, I looked across the road, and believe it or not, I saw a bike, my bike, chained to a lamppost just where the Garfunkels had been. So I went up to it. This was 5 years later. It looked pretty much the same, but it had new tyres and new saddle, but I remembered the bike, same scratches. It wasn't the most expensive bike. So somebody 5 years later had chained my bike up at the same place it had been stolen from. So that was crazy enough. If I hadn't heard the song Garfunkel's and waited around for a couple of minutes to talk to the backstage crew, I would have got my train, not waited half an hour, not gone across the road for a coffee, and not seen my bike. And then I had an idea. I looked at the lock, and I swear on my life, it was the same cable lock that I had. It's the same one. 4 digits, 4 numbers, so that's 10,000 combinations. So what had happened all those years before was either the person who stole it had spent a whole week while I was inside the theatre and they were just going through the 10,000 possible combinations, or I hadn't locked it properly and not twisted the numbers round, so it was quite easy for them to take the bike. Then I had this thought, I bet they haven't changed the number. I bet it's all happening, all of these coincidences. Maybe the combination is the same. And the combination was the same. It was a family date that I always remember. and I try and use it for different combinations. I tried it, it worked, and then I had two options. Would I wait to see who had taken the bike in the first place? Or do I get my train? I took my bike, I got on the train, and I went home. And I still use the bike to this very day. Never found out who took the bike, and I quite like the fact that I never found out. A little unsolved mystery there. So quite a few stories that I wanted to tell you that will have to wait to another time, or for another time. I do apologise. There's a great Anthony Hopkins coincidence story, which I'll save for another time. I wanted to talk about something that happened, another thing, weird thing that happened to me at Drury Lane many years ago. I also wanted to talk about other unsolved mysteries in this area and around the country, around the world as well. And we shall get to them, but we are nearing the final story of the tour, and it's a weird one because it's not really a story, it's just something somebody said to me. But in advance, I'd like to thank you for listening in tonight, and I hope to see you very, very soon. So there we are. We're on Albert Bridge Road now, and I just wanted to make sure that, well, hopefully everyone's okay. We survived it. It's still quite bright. The bridge is bright. I've survived. We haven't managed to see any ghosts, any doppelgangers, any vanished people, any people involved in time lapses. But I hope that it was kind of interesting what we were doing. Just want to say that when we started this tour, when I decided originally a couple of weeks ago that I was going to do it here on Albert Bridge, it was only because, well, something happened. It happened to me. Well, I say it happened to me. It happened to a friend of mine who was convinced that she saw me on Albert Bridge, and it was about a year ago, and she said, I crossed over the bridge and I waved to her, and I was going from the west to the east, so I was going into Battersea Park about this time of the evening, about a year ago. And she texted me that night. She said, how's it all going? And I said, yeah, it's all going well. How are you? It's another actor friend of mine. And I said, what are you up to? And she started saying all the things that she was doing. I started saying what I was doing. And then she said, it was so good to see you today. You look like you didn't have time to chat. And I said, where did we see each other? And she said, on Albert Bridge. And I said, yeah, I was in the West End. I wasn't anywhere near Albert Bridge. But it must have been someone else. And she said, yeah, you had a yellow coat, you had a cap on, you had your glasses, and you walked across the road, and you waved to the other side, and you said, I'll give you a call. And I said, it wasn't me. And she said, it was definitely you, because it was your voice and it was your yellow rain mac. And that's kind of the reason that I wanted to come here today, because I thought, well, it was about a year ago, it was about this time, and I thought, well, we're on Albert Bridge. I haven't walked along this bridge at this time of night for quite a long time. I thought it might be interesting as a bit of an experiment to see if I turned up. which is weird, I know, but well, let's just turn the camera around for one sec. No, nothing, sadly. Thanks for watching tonight, and I'll see you very soon. Wait a minute. It's interesting when you come down to the River Thames that it can look a bit eerie and strange at night. And the reason that I wanted to come down here was really because a couple of years ago, I noticed on a Facebook group that people were discussing some kind of flashing light under the river. It was a bit further east near Canary Wharf. And there was a woman, Juliana. It was August 2021. She had been out and about, and she just seemed to notice a flashing light beneath the water. And it rapidly flashed on and off. And she posted it on a Facebook group, and nobody could really explain what it was. Some people thought it might have actually been a submarine just parked beneath the water, but the river is not that deep here, so a submarine really shouldn't be able to come up the Thames here where it's quite shallow. Quite a few people suggested it was a beacon of some sort, just designed to warn ships about maybe a hidden hazard. And it begs the question, what is lurking in the water? The River Thames, it's been a site of sacred rites, pagan ritual. A lot of popular celebrations have happened around the river since ancient times. People have spoken about ghosts, dreams that they've had about the river, the strange stories that have happened on the bridges which cross London. It is an interesting subject about a river which is strangely one of the cleanest rivers in the world that flows through a major city. In the 1950s, the Natural History Museum actually declared the River Thames biologically dead. And the most important change to the river was the improvement of the sewer systems, the sewerage, in the late 1960s. And obviously cleaning up, it's an ongoing process. But it is one of the cleanest rivers. Is now home to about 120 or so different species of fish. So you have salmon, eels, some people have seen seals and porpoises, and even whales have been seen in the River Thames. Used to hold frost fairs on the surface. Happened a lot in Tudor times. The last one was in the 1800s. And between the 1600s and the 1800s, this part of the river didn't really have a proper embankment. So they would hold these fairs, a kind of winter wonderland with market stalls, selling food and drinks, many different activities like football, dancing. They had horse racing, ice skating. And at one point, famously, an elephant was led across the Thames just below Blackfriars Bridge. So it's a fascinating river, and there are some fascinating tales to do with it. There's a man named Roberto Calvi, Calvi, who was nicknamed God's Banker because of the financial work he did with the Vatican. But he's better known, not because of his work, but the manner of his death. He was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge, right in the centre of London, and it was on June 18th, 1982. He had 5 bricks in his pockets. He had about $15,000 worth of cash in 3 different currencies. Now, leading up to his death, Roberto Calvi had been accused of stealing money from the mafia, and it sounds like this situation is the setup of a crime thriller. And even in the film Godfather 3, they make a reference to it where one of the accountants that works with the Vatican and the mafia was found hanging from a bridge in London. But in the July, so he died in the July, a jury at an inquest declared the hanging a suicide. And not everyone was convinced about this. They had a second inquest in 1983, so the year after, and that declared an open verdict. And then fast forward to 2002, there were a group of forensic investigators, and they were appointed by Italian judges, and what they concluded was that Calvi had been murdered and hung from the bridge after his death. So he had actually died before, and then they hung him, his dead body, from the bridge. So some people think it's mafia. Some people think that it was suicide. And a lot of people now think that the murder will never be solved because those involved just have too much power. They're a mixture of presidents of banks, the military, top security, politicians, and the mixture of those people mean that probably the truth, and they have spent the equivalent of about $25 million on lawyers and private investigators. This is just the family of Calvi alone. It just seems like this mystery will never be solved. And a lot of animals have been found. As I mentioned, fish, of course, whales, which is amazing to think that they could manage to find themselves all the way up here. In 1251, King Henry III was given a present by the King of Norway, nothing less than a polar bear, and it was kept at the Tower of London. And on very hot days, a polar bear used to go swimming in the River Thames. Not too far from here, at St Pancras Old Church, they were doing some work a few years back, and they were expanding St Pancras Station for the Eurostar. And the area had been used as a mass grave in the 19th century, and over 40,000 bodies were interned there in the 1800s. But there was one coffin in particular that was pretty strange. There was one coffin that was found that had the remains of 8 people and a walrus. And there's still no answer as to why this giant mammal was in the capital. Some people have theorised that it was dissected by medical students, but there are no records of any exotic animals coming to London. They're sea monsters, really, or they were considered that in the 1800s. But to find the remains of a walrus, it's no longer a question that is just of interest to Beatle fans. Who is the walrus? That's what I want to know. And it was 4 meters, 13 feet long. That's the St Pancras walrus. Over inside the Natural History Museum, that's the site of another animal mystery, but it's a mystery bug. And it was 2008. There was an entomologist, Max Barkley, who found a bug living in the museum's gardens. Now, the Natural History Museum has 28 million bugs on record. And when Max found this one hanging in the building's grounds, he didn't recognise it, but he decided to check what it was, and it turned out to be one of these great mysteries. There was no record of where the insect had come from or what it was. They say the creature's closest relative was American, the box elder bug, and they had found similar specimens around the Mediterranean coast in France. But Max found the bug when it just landed on him when he was having a sandwich in the museum's gardens. So it's interesting that there are still undiscovered animals, even in the centre of London. Where I live, southeast London, not too far from a place called Sydenham, there have been sightings of beasts, or a beast, which has now been named the Beast of Sydenham. And it was first encountered in 2005 by a resident named Tony Holder. And it was in March 2005. He was out looking for his cat, and he said that he came under attack. He said a 5 foot long, which is about close to 2 meters, just under, animal pounced on him. And he said it was like a panther or a large cat, and it pinned him to the ground. It ran off before doing any serious damage. But Mr. Holder was treated for scratches by ambulance crew. The police team came along and they were armed with tranquilizer guns. They just looked through the area in search of the beast without success. The police did take it seriously. Large black cats do exist in the country, but to see one 5 foot long in a suburban area, Sydenham, it's been seen a few times. The last sighting apparently was in 2009, when a jogger was chased by the animal. There have been quite a few strange items found in the river over the years. Now, people do an awful lot of mudlarking here. This was something that went on a few hundred years back. It was mainly children that did it. And the river, because it's tidal, when it was a low tide, they would go to the shorelines and just dig through with small shovels and find coins, find maybe plastic crocodiles. They found one of those in 2017. One of those was seen floating along the river. That caused a bit of consternation with the onlookers. They found a sword, which would have been from the 1500s, and that was spotted a couple of years ago. But the strangest item was a giant Michael Jackson statue that was found floating down the Thames in 1995. Nobody knows why it was put there, and it was from the period that the Michael Jackson album History came out, so it may well have been that the singer was using the statue to promote his album, and after it had been finished with, after the promotion had been done with, they just threw the statue in the river. But we're not sure, we'll never know. They found a 5,000-year-old human bone. That was only last year. And they also found a Victoria Cross. Now, Victoria Cross is awarded to the British and Commonwealth forces, so sailors, soldiers, the Air Force, and there are only 1,300, just over, that have ever been given out for bravery, and there are only 2 of them that are unaccounted for. The 2 that are missing belong to Private John Byrne, who was from Kilkenny in Ireland, and a man named John McDermott, who was registered as a Chelsea pensioner in 1862. Now, a few years ago, a man in Putney found a Victoria Cross on the shoreline. So one of the two that was ever missing. And they're not sure whose it is, so there is a mystery to do with it, but they think it might be John Burns. Because he fell on hard times, and when he was very, very young, he took his own life. He regretted, and maybe what we would now call had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and he regretted the service that he gave in the war, and it really affected him, and he took his own life by the river in the 1850s. And some people have suggested that maybe when he took his own life just before he threw his own cross, his own award for bravery, into the river. So it's a very sad story, but it is still a mystery how they found a Victoria Cross that would have been over 160 years since it had been given. Now, we're saying it's one of the cleanest rivers that is in a major city, but hasn't always been this way. Underneath us, we've got 86 miles of waste pipes. Now, the river's not that deep in central London. It's quite shallow, so the waste cannot be handled. It can't be taken in by the river here, but it can be further east. And in the late 1800s, an engineer with the Metropolitan Board of Works, Joseph Basil Jett, was appointed to redesign the sewer system and gradually pump the waste through pipes and then pumping stations further east to Essex, where the river is twice, if not 3 times as deep in some places, and the river can handle it. The problem all started in the 1850s. Now, the river wasn't that clean, and in 1858 something happened called the Great Stink. And it happened, this powerful stench, it basically terrorised London for a couple of months, and it was obviously here where the city's sewers from all the other canals and waterways and smaller lost rivers which still exist in London, like Fleet Street was part of the River Fleet, the Walbrook, they emptied their waste into the River Thames. And it increased. The population more than doubled in the 1800s. And although they had installed and invented flushable toilets in the city, it seemed to just increase. Now, Michael Faraday, the scientist, in 1855, he reported that the waste from the sewers had turned the river's water into what he called, and I quote, an opaque, pale brown fluid with an unpleasant smell and dense clouds of fecal matter. And then in the summer of 1858, a heat wave hit the city and caused such an amazing amount of waste within the river to just ferment, and the river started to smell worse than it had ever done before. So 3 cholera outbreaks, epidemics had hit the city in the 20 or so previous years, and people across the city just believed that they could get cholera once more from smelling the river. People in those days, a lot of people were what we would now call miasmists. They believed in miasma, that smells caused all diseases. But of course, a man named John Snow, an epidemiologist, he determined that Londoners' fear of the Great Stink, it was kind of misplaced, that cholera was more caused through the water fountains that were running through the sewer system. So actually smelling the river wouldn't kill you, but drinking the water that ran alongside the waste pipes might. So the Great Stink, nothing was done until the smell gradually went outside the Houses of Parliament, and it was debated that these honourable and wonderful men, lords and gentlemen in Parliament, they shouldn't have to deal with this smell anymore. So Joseph Bazalgette was appointed, and he constructed over 80 miles of new sewers. And the river and the drinking water just became cleaner. Lastly, I wanted to tell you about a few ghosts associated with the River Thames. Although I think it's about 215 miles long, most of the Thames ghosts seem to be found in this short stretch of river that flows through central London. Some of them are associated with historical events, and some of the stories actually ended up being reported in the media as they were being seen. A few miles from here is the Blackwall Tunnel, and it goes underneath the river. So it goes further east and north from here. It was built in Victorian times just to carry a road beneath the River Thames between an area Tower Hamlets and Greenwich. And in 1972, a motorcyclist stopped to pick up a boy, and he saw him hitchhiking at the southern end of the tunnel, and he didn't want the boy to walk through this 1.5 mile long tunnel. So the boy gave the man the address he wanted to get to, and he climbed up behind the rider. But when the motorcyclist left the tunnel at the northern end, he found that the passenger was missing. And he went back through the tunnel to try and find him, without success. So this was 1972. Apparently the rider then went to the address that he had been given, and he was told that a young boy, answering the description of the lad he had seen, had indeed lived at that address, but he had been killed in a traffic accident some years before. Who knows? There does seem to be a few ghosts in this area which involve people being seen jumping from the river, which is a terribly sad thing to experience if you see that. Not too far from here is Cleopatra's Needle, which is 3,500 years old. It's this 70-foot tall monument. Now, it's got absolutely no connection to Cleopatra, by the way, but it was given to the British government by the people of Egypt in 1819. And there were quite a few difficulties transporting this obelisk back, and sad to say that quite a few sailors were drowned during the journey, and it wasn't until 1878 that the monument was finally erected here on the Thames embankment. Some people have heard laughter, mocking laughter is sometimes heard in this area. Some people have said that they've heard unearthly screams. But just near here, somebody said that they saw a ghostly man, a naked man, who has been seen a couple of times dashing, sort of running from behind the monument and jumping into the cold water. What I like to talk about on these unexplained mysteries are not necessarily things that are spooky or evil or murder related. Some of them can be, of course, but some of them are objects or people or happenings which have caused polarity. So people have discussed them and they can't seem to come up with a consensus. So one side thinks one side thinks the other. And this item, more than any other, I think, really embodies that. This is the Shroud of Turin, and it's a 14-foot linen cloth, simply put. But what it does is it bears an image of a crucified man. And for a lot of people, it's become a popular Christian, if not specifically Catholic, icon. For many people, it is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ. But for others, probably more so, it is a religious icon, and it reflects the story of Christ, but maybe not necessarily the original shroud. It's appeared in records for over 600 years, and it remains this important symbol. The first time it surfaced in documented evidence was in the 1350s in medieval France, in a place called Liry, L-I-R-E-Y. And it was a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, and he presented it to the dean of the church in Liry, and he presented it as Jesus's authentic burial shroud. There's no record that exists of how de Charny got his hands on the shroud, nor where it was in the over 1300 intervening years since Christ's burial outside Jerusalem. The Pope, in the 1300s, he soon declared it was not an actual historic relic, but after the Church of Liry put the shroud on display, the church did begin to draw a lot of pilgrims, and also a lot of money. However, many prominent members of the church, they remained skeptical of its authenticity. Now we get to around 1389. Pierre d'Arcy, the Bishop of Troyes in France, sends a report to Pope Clement VII. And it claims, this report, that an artist had confessed to forging the shroud. Furthermore, d'Arcy claimed the dean of the Liry church knew it was a fake and had simply used it to raise money anyway. In response, the Pope declared that the shroud was not the true burial cloth of Christ. Still, he said the Liry church could continue to display it if it acknowledged the cloth was a man-made religious icon rather than a historic relic. And today, to this very day, Pope Francisco, still describes it as an icon rather than a relic. De Charny's granddaughter was excommunicated for selling it to Italian royals, and in 1418, when the 100 Years' War threatened to spill over into Liry, Geoffroy de Charny's granddaughter, Margaret de Charny, and her husband, they offered to store the cloth in their castle. Her husband wrote a receipt for the exchange, and he acknowledged that the cloth was not Christ's authentic burial shroud, and he promised to return the shroud when it was safe to do so. However, she, Margaret, later refused to return it, and instead took it on basically a tour, advertising it as Christ's real burial shroud. We jump forward in time, 1453, still nowhere near present day, but things are happening. Margaret de Charny sold the shroud in exchange for 2 castles to the royal palace of Savoy, which ruled over parts of modern-day France, Italy, and Switzerland. This house later was given or ascended to the Italian throne, and she was punished. As punishment for selling the shroud, she again received excommunication. Before the shroud moved to Turin, it was lost in a fire. This was 1502. The House of Savoy placed the shroud in the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry which is now part of France. 1532, a fire broke out in the chapel. It melted part of the silver in the container protecting the shroud, and the silver fell onto part of the shroud, burning straight through it. And the burn marks and the water stains from where the fire was extinguished are still visible on the shroud today. 1578, the House of Savoy moves the shroud to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, which had later then become part of Italy, and it has remained there ever since 1578, with the exception of World War II, when the Italians relocated it for safekeeping. So since 1578, this name has continued, the Shroud of Turin, or the Turin Shroud. Now, there have been many scientific studies about its authenticity, despite the fact that Pope Clement VII had declared the shroud a fake over 600 years ago. There's been no end to the debate about the shroud and what it means, and possibly that it's historic rather than just an icon. Most of this started in the late 19th, early 20th century. People on both sides of the debate, they began to start bolstering the arguments, forcing the arguments through with scientific studies. In the 1970s, the Shroud of Turin research project said that the markings of the cloth were consistent with a crucified body and that the stains were real human blood. 1988, one group of scientists said that their analysis showed the shroud originated between 1260 and 1390, and while another report said that the analysis showed it could actually originate between 300 BC and AD 400, so it would have been covering the time of Christ. And then in 2018, researchers used maybe more detailed forensic techniques to argue that the blood stains on the shroud couldn't have come from Christ. So there are a few questions about the shroud which will never be answered. One side, the faithful, the believers, believe it is the shroud, the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. Then there is another side that believe it's an elaborate medieval forgery. And then there are the people in the middle who, although, like the Catholic Church today, they say it's not the shroud of Jesus Christ, it's not his burial shroud, but it is an iconic relic. But having answered all of those three questions, one question, the question of questions as it has been identified, is still up for grabs. How did these forgers in the 14th century create something using blood which, when looked at through a 3D lens, looks three-dimensional? They've created something so elaborate that scientists, geneticists, microbiologists have pondered over how it was actually created. And that's the real unexplained mystery of the Turin Shroud. What we're going to talk about now are the Toynbee Tiles, Toynbee tiles. Now, they're believed to be made of linoleum and asphalt and crack sealant. They are license plate sized, and they're colourful, and they're mosaic tiles, and they've been seen on the floor in about 24 major American cities since the 1980s. And they're called the Toynbee Tiles. Their origin and their purpose are a bit of a mystery. They're inscribed, typically, with a certain phrase, and it's a bit of a confusing one. And the phrase reads, "Toynbee idea in movie 2001, Resurrect Dead on Planet Jupiter. So make of that what you will. These tiles were originally discovered in Philadelphia. They've also been documented in many other cities: Pittsburgh, Cleveland, St. Louis, Cincinnati, New Jersey, New York, Washington, Boston, and even some in South America. Now, there's been a bit of a lull, so there was a gap, but they began in 2011, this new tiles that started to appear again, and they appeared in New York and Philadelphia. The first ones were always in Philadelphia, and then there was a gap. Now, we're not sure why, this hiatus. It could be that the age of the tiler and the decades of maybe installing these cryptic tiles by night, and it would have to have been by night, maybe that had caught up with them. They might have fallen ill, they might have passed away. And some people speculate that this gap was sparked by the attention that was drawn by a documentary in 2011, and it was called Resurrect Dead, The Mystery of the Toynbee Tiles. There was a 30-year span in which the tiles had been installed, and then suddenly it stopped for a bit. And maybe the documentary and the tile maker himself felt, well, I need to take a bit of a back seat because I might get found out. More people are getting to know about this. These tiles, they're generally laid in the summer months, and it's quite clever what they do. After this design is created, it's believed that the tiles are wrapped in tar paper, like roofing felt. It's the material that would be commonly used on, say, a garden shed. And it's laid between the shingles and the roof felt itself. It creates this waterproof barrier. But basically what happens is it does perish and it does gradually disappear. So what is supposed to happen, and we think happens, is these tiles are put into position. They're stuck onto the ground with this asphalt sealant. And then over the weeks and months, the weight of car tyres and foot traffic, combined with the summer heat, they just help to gradually fuse each tile to the street, and they wear down the paper covering. And the paper covering is normally the same as the asphalt colour on the pavement or the sidewalk. So as the cars are going over it and people are walking over them, they don't realise they're walking on something that could have been laid the night before. And then eventually the messages and the images that are carved out by the unknown artist are revealed. No one's certain about the length of time it takes for the tile to fully stick to the asphalt, because there's no telling exactly when one of the tiles has been laid. And we think that installing them and then their appearance on the street can take 2 weeks to a month to complete. Now, followers and fans and people curious about this phenomena, they believe that these typical tiles are created by one person, and they call him the tile maker. And what the people say is that they're laid out by simply being placed or tossed out of a hole in a floorboard of a car. So a car just gradually goes along the street and then lays one tile underneath itself. And maybe that's why nobody has ever laid hands or eyes on the tile maker themselves. There's a man called Christian Houselane, and he's a Toynbee Tile fan. And he says one of his favourite things to do is just go on really long walks with no real destination in mind. And wherever he goes, the first thing that he kind of looks for on the street, wherever he is in the US, is Toynbee tiles. And he finds them. There are quite a few of them now in existence. He says he never knows how they got there, what they mean, and there are now hundreds of them. They seem to refer a bit to Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that film focuses on a man who is reborn on a mission to Jupiter. And there's also a Ray Bradbury science fiction story called The Toynbee Convector, and that's about a time traveller who returns to the present to inspire his contemporaries to build a better future for themselves. And then this is combined with an excerpt from a 20th century philosopher and historian, Arnold J. Toynbee. And Arnold J. Toynbee famously has said that he believes that the afterlife is not automatic, it's man-made. And inside everyone, you've got the fuel to make it happen. So, the idea is to repopulate Jupiter, and that's how you get to the afterlife. Now, the media didn't officially recognise these tiles till about 1994. They think that there has been a message board that has been moderated by the tile maker themselves. Somebody that seems to know kind of quite quickly when these tiles were laid. It is an interesting mystery because over the years the tiles have become appearing with additional side message attached to them. So one of the most eerie ones was, "Murder every journalist, I beg of you." So we're not sure about these tiles. We certainly know that a couple of them have been found in Dover in England, most of them though in the US. And there are many theories on who the tiler really is, but no concrete evidence has ever been found. I like these hidden object stories when I read M.R. James and Stephen King and Philip K. Dick. And these objects, the Toynbee tiles, really seem to be objects hidden in plain sight until a few months later they just appear. Maybe, like the Turin Shroud, we'll never know the true story. There's this great coincidence story about Anthony Hopkins, and this was a few years before he was becoming a leading man in Hollywood. He was a well-respected actor. He'd done a lot of theatre in the UK, and finally, for him, he had managed to secure a part in a Hollywood film. It was called The Girl from Petrovka, and it was a comedy thriller alongside the great Goldie Hawn. And the movie itself is more famous because of the coincidence story that was told by Hopkins than maybe the film itself. Anyway, what normally happens is when an actor gets a part in a movie that's based on a book, most of the time what you do is read the screenplay, because you're not filming the novel. Somebody has adapted the novel, so you concentrate on the screenplay. But then if you get the role, you go back to read the original source material. And that's exactly what Hopkins did. He secured the role in the film, and then he went looking for a copy of the novel, The Girl from Petrovka, and it was written by a man called George Pfeiffer. And this was the 70s. He was in London. He couldn't find a copy of the book anywhere. He wanted it straight away rather than order it. And then later on, one afternoon, he's walking through London and he notices an abandoned book on a park bench. Now, of all the books in the entire world that this man could have found right when he needed it, well, what might that book have been? Yep, The Girl from Petrovka. Now, that would be a nice enough coincidence in itself. But 2 years later, when they were filming, it'd taken a long time to get the film into proper production, Hopkins met George Pfeiffer during the filming. So Pfeiffer came to the set one day and they were talking away about the source material, the original novel, and Pfeiffer had said, "I don't have a proper copy of my own book." And he said, I did have one, and it was personally annotated, and I let it go. I lent it to a friend, and he lost it in London. You know where this is going. Hopkins brought out his copy and just said, is this the copy you're looking for, George? And it was the same copy. There's no word as to whether or not Anthony Hopkins gave Pfeiffer the book back, though. It's quite a nice little story. Let's talk about my bike. My bike, which I lost about 15 years back. So the circumstances around losing it, they were a bit annoying at the time. I've understood why it may have happened, but the circumstances around me finding the bike again were the really curious part. Now, I was acting in a play on tour. It was about 15 years ago. The company of us were travelling to cities around the south of England. Now, whenever I get, and it's not that often, but it does happen, a little touring job in a play, you get this great chance to stay in places that you might not normally visit. And normally, if you do visit them, you might go for a day or two, but you get to stay for a week or 2 weeks. So it's not like a day trip. You get to really know parts of the country, sometimes parts of the world. Now, most of the cast and crew and the costume department, they're going to be busy on the Sunday in between the venues changing. What I used to do is drive home on the Saturday night and then drive to the new location the Monday morning. And I always tried to stay a bit outside the main town centre, so not right next to the theatre. And I'd always bring my bicycle, with me. And it meant that I could pay less for accommodation outside the town and get some exercise when you were there. Anyway, we're in a place called Guildford, just outside London. The company were paying for the accommodation, so I thought I might as well do the same. They pay you subsistence. They give you a certain amount of money each week, and they say use that for travel and accommodation. So I thought, okay, I will stay outside the town centre. The rent for the apartment or the room in a house will be cheaper, and I'll feel I'm somehow winning. I'm making money rather than spending extra money in town, and I'm getting the exercise. So I thought, I'll do the same. I'll stay outside and I'll cycle around for a week. On the final night, the Saturday, just before the final bow, I had rushed back to my dressing room, packed everything into my backpack, so that after the bow, the curtain call, I could just run back to the dressing room, get my backpack and cycle back to the car, and I could try and get home before midnight. I got out of the theatre. I went across the road. My bike had been stolen. I had chained it outside a restaurant called Garfunkel's. It was just round the corner from the theatre. The cable lock was gone. It was one of those keypad ones, you know, with 5 or 4 numbers. This one particularly had. So it would have been about 10,000 combinations. Anyway, the cable lock itself was gone. I got a cab back to my car, drove home, pretty annoyed, but it wasn't an expensive bike, so it wasn't the end of the world. 5 years after this, I get another tour, a different play, a different route around the country, but one of the stops was in Guildford. So it's 5 years difference. And this time I got the train there every day. They weren't paying for the accommodation, and I thought it's going to take me an hour and a half to get home, but I'd rather stay at home than rent a room. So they had done up the main town centre, especially just outside the train station. Everything was a bit different. The Garfunkels that I had chained my bike outside 5 years previous, that was gone. It was now a different restaurant. Anyway, the last night, the Saturday night, I did my usual routine, packed up my stuff from the dressing room, and I took the final bow after the curtain call. I went to say goodbye to the stage doorkeeper, and then I went on stage to say goodbye to the crew. Now, straight away after a show finishes, the crew are packing up and dismantling the stage because they want to get going to the next venue. They had the radio on. And I said, thanks for everything, guys. See you again. See you on Monday. And the song on the radio was Art Garfunkel's Bright Eyes. And I said, oh, Garfunkel's. And one of the crew said, well, what are you talking about? And I said, well, and I stayed for a few minutes and I told them the story of when I had been there the last time and my bike was stolen outside Garfunkel's near the station. And I said, oh, I'm glad that restaurant's gone. I went back to the station, and because I had been having this chat with the crew, I ended up just missing my train. So I had about half an hour before the next one to Clapham Junction in southwest London. So I thought I would pop to get a coffee just outside the station, again across the road. So I went and got my coffee, and I came back out and I looked at the station, and I looked just to the left of the station, and believe it or not, I saw a bike. It looked like my bike, and it wasn't chained there when I came out of the train station, but it was then there when I came out of the cafe. So within about 3 minutes, my bike had been chained to a lamppost just where it had been 5 years before. I went up to it, looked pretty much the same. Had a new saddle, a couple of new tyres, but I remembered it. So somebody 5 years later had chained my bike up at the same place it had been stolen from. And then I had this idea. The cable lock had gone 5 years before, and I looked at the lock, and I swear on my life it was the same keypad lock I had. 4 numbers, 10,000 combinations. And it was my lock. I remembered the scratches on it. So whoever had stolen it had spent either a week while I was inside the theatre going through all 10,000 possible combinations, or, as I had imagined, I had not locked it properly and I had not twisted the numbers round after I clicked the lock into place. And then I had another thought. Hold on, the lock's the same. Maybe the combination is. And I had always used the same combination. It was an important family date, so I tried it, and it worked. And they hadn't changed the combination, so I had 2 options. Would I wait to see who had actually taken the bike in the first place, or would I take my own bike and get on my train? I took my bike, and I got on my train, and I still use it to this very day.
To fly.
It's lovely to see you all. This is me, and I've got this fellow singing behind me. I want to welcome you all to the West End. And we're going to take a walk around a very busy West End. So I hope the signal stays with us. And we're going to talk about some ghosts of the West End on the way. If you've never met me before,
Thank you very
I'd like
much.
to welcome you.
Thank you.
If you have met me before, you know what to expect. A bit of history, a bit of geography, some bad jokes on the way. Now we're on the east side of Trafalgar Square. Not too far, as you can see right now, from Charing Cross Station. That's in the centre of the screen. And there is St. Martin in the Fields Church. beautifully lit. But the Duke of York's just behind the bus there, up St Martin's Lane, in 2011 had a play called Ghost Stories, written by a man called Jeremy Dyson, who was a comic writer, worked with a company called the League of Gentlemen, and Andy Nyman, who works with an amazing British mentalist named Derren Brown. And it opened up on St Martin's Lane, 2011. Very clever story, quite short, but they really tried to up the tension for Ghost Stories. Even before the play began, in the lobby, in the corridors, they had the sound of howling wind, very lightly played through speakers. The lights would accidentally flick on and off. The air conditioning was turned up just a team decided to run this little competition. 6 people were locked in coffins for 8 hours one night on the stage before the play opened. And the idea was simply for them to spend a night in the coffin to win a trip to New York. 8 hours doesn't seem like much. Took a sleeping pill, you'd be okay. But gradually throughout those 8 hours, staff were employed to scrape their nails on the side of the coffin, and it would be followed by an hour's silence. Then there would be chains dragged over them. And then the spookiest thing to me was the sound of a child played through a speaker saying the word "Daddy" every now and then. The participants said that they would, all 6 of them, they would have stayed, except one of them needed to go to the toilet. They were terrified when they got out, but only 5 of the 6 remained in. And the Duke of York seemed the perfect theatre to house that show because it has more than its fair share of ghosts. We won't go too far up the road, but possess ghosts. It's difficult to know which theatres to really start at on this tour, but here at the Duke of York's, well, it's as good a place as any. We will be ending at the most haunted theatre in the West End. That's the Theatre 52, and for a while it was called the Trust, which staged here in 1905. An acting couple named Frank that very day. Staff and audiences and her grandma and what the child was doing. Yeah, I just saw this woman in a tiara and a long white gown. A lot of them seem to be about haunted. '70s. There was a very famous at the time actress, Thora Hird, who wore a jacket which was supposed to be haunted. A strange thing, a haunted object, a piece of clothing, seemed to shrink every time she put on it. The wardrobe department, they had to find one. It was called a monkey jacket, a bolero style jacket. They found it from a second-hand shop. It seemed to fit Thora perfectly in the beginning anyway. And then gradually each performance seemed to become tighter. I just want to show you the thinnest, the narrowest, if you do come ever to London. Perfectly in the beginning. And then gradually each performance seemed to get tighter. And Thora was insistent that she hadn't put on weight. She said she weighed herself religiously, and she thought it was the fault of the dressers. She thought, well, they're dry cleaning it, it shrunk. The dressers had said it was always the same size when they put it back on the mannequin at the end of the show. But Thora said she always felt that it just got tighter around the arms and the chest during the bow, the curtain call. She always felt out of breath. And then Marjorie, a stage manager, tried it, fitted her fine. After a few minutes, she then felt the same tightness. Next to try it was the director's wife, a similar build. Again, it felt fine. Again, after a few minutes, it tightened. The strange thing was, when she took it off, those that were present saw red hand marks around her throat. Now, the company themselves found it quite funny, really. But being a superstitious lot, as actors are, Thora herself decided not to wear it. And then someone, for maybe a creepy joke, suggested they bring in a medium, a paranormalist, to do some investigating. And the medium said when she held the jacket, she had visions of a woman who she said was called Edith. And she got a vision of Edith being strangled by a man. The director was still curious, still not maybe convinced, but curious about the story. And they decided to go one stage further. And they went into Trafalgar Square, where we started the tour, and they found a random casting people in those days. They all went back to the theatre. The woman who tried it on, well, her husband touched her arm, and he said afterwards he felt his hands moving upwards towards her throat. They decided not to just burn the jacket, not to get rid of it in any conventional way, if it's considered a ghost story. It was sold to a film company in America. I suppose in theatre they'd never want to waste a penny. And we don't know where it is now, this bolero jacket, this monkey jacket. But if you're ever somewhere in America in a thrift shop, if you see a short Victorian velvet jacket, I'd say give it a busy little chunk for a while. And we are just off the side of Covent Garden. Now, ghosts in theatres are in abundance. Theatre people are very superstitious. They say never whistle on stage. Sailors in the old days were the original backstage crew. It's why we use the word crew in a theatre. They were the crew off the ships. They were good at working pulleys. They were not afraid to work at great heights. They were strong. We use the word crew. We use the word lighting rig. We use the word scenery dock. And they say never whistle on stage because that's how sailors communicated. When they were at sea, a command might be misinterpreted or misheard or not heard at all, but a melody, especially in a high pitch, if you know anything about acoustics, a high-pitched note travels further. Hence, any siren from an ambulance or a police car, they don't say duh 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 duh, they say da 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 da. The higher pitches travel further. And if you whistle on stage, the idea would be, really, well, you might end up giving the sailors a cue to drop scenery on your head. It's not necessarily a ghost, it's a superstition. Never whistle on stage, you might end up with scenery on your head, which, well, it's not lucky. We're on Maiden Lane, by the way. Nice little area. I'll take a little moment here just to wait for a few people to go past. A very famous man was murdered here many years ago. His name was William Terrace. William Terrace was basically a matinee idol. Sailor Bill, Breezy Bill, late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s. Probably the most popular theatrical star in the country, and he played in melodramas. Very heavy on plot, a lot of emotional appeal, sentimental dialogue. But the mellow bit of it was that they always had a musical underscore. And the shows were normally about forbidden longing, nostalgic. They appealed to the high emotions. And Terrace was the king. But he had a rival, and the rival was named Richard Arthur Prince. He was more of an extra, not on the same level at all. A bit deluded, really. And he was jealous of William Terrace. Richard Arthur Prince fell on hard times. Terrace bailed him out a bit. Got him a job at the Adelphi here. And Prince, it seemed, well, it seemed that he felt he was a better actor than he was given credit for. Lost a lot of money, he gambled, he drank. He wasn't making much from acting. He developed a strong jealousy of William Terrace, who actually was helping him financially. And they were seen arguing one night, just here, outside the stage door of the Adelphi. And on the 16th of December, 1897, Prince concealed himself in a doorway, and he jumped out and he stabbed Terrace. Terrace was brought to a dressing room, died half an hour later. Prince was arrested. He was considered mentally unstable, and he was sent to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, as it was known, in Berkshire. 50,000 people lined the streets for Terrace's funeral. And he's buried in Brompton Cemetery near Knightsbridge, but his ghost is said to haunt the area to this very day. He walks along the corridors of the theatre. He's seen standing here at stage door at the Adelphi, which is now showing Back to the Future, the musical. Terrifying show. Also, he's strangely seen at Covent Garden Tube Station. Now, considering Terrace was murdered in the 1890s and Covent Garden Tube opened in 1907, well, that's a bit strange. But apparently, ghost hunters have worked out, researched, that his favourite bakery is there. Okay, we'll just make our way past the big crowds here and continue our little trip. The word ghost appears in theatre not just in ghostly terms, but we have something called ghost lights. Just a single lampshade with a single bulb, not even a shade sometimes, just a stick with one bulb on top of it, which a lot of theatres leave open and on at night. It used to be thought by superstitious actors that to leave a light on for the ghosts was a nice thing, but actually it's a practical thing, in this country anyway. Especially in the 1970s. We had many power cuts in London, and crew would come in during the day into a dark theatre. Bear in mind the auditorium wouldn't have any lights on, so you'd be walking into pitch darkness even at 7 o'clock in the morning. And if you saw that bulb lit on stage, you knew that there was no problem with the electrics and there was no power cut. So the idea of a ghost light was a practical thing. The best theatre ghosts seem to emanate really from one theatre, and it's the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. We're approaching it through Covent Garden. I was going to walk along this side road, Tavistock Street, but as it's a lovely evening, we'll take a little walk through the centre of Covent Garden. Drury Lane was one of the first theatres in the country, playhouses built after the restoration of Charles II in 1660. You might know from being on some of my Shakespeare walks that the theatres originally were in Shoreditch, then the theatres started to get more successful on the South Bank. The most successful, of course, was Shakespeare's Globe, still very successful. And then we had 18 years, from about 1642 to 1660, of Puritan rule. And they closed the theatres. More or less everything was forbidden in their time. Theatre, singing, dancing, sport, gambling, brothels. All my hobbies were gone. Tough times for somebody like me. And then the new king, Charles II, decided to commission new theatres, but he didn't want them in the poor area of town. He wanted them here in Covent Garden, where rich people lived, and where, more importantly, he lived. And the first two were called the Theatre Royal Lincoln's Inn and the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. The building in front of us, by the way, is underground. There's going to be a brand new premiere here on YouTube. A lot of tunnels still exist underneath Covent Garden, designed by Inigo Jones in the 1630s. But when Covent Garden Market opened around the same time, the aristocracy said, there are too many horses, there's too much manure, it's too smelly, it's too crime-ridden, we'll move further west. So they moved to areas like Piccadilly, Mayfair, the King's Road, Fulham, Chelsea, Kensington, Knightsbridge, further west. They kept moving further and further away. And Drury Lane was given a royal patent or patent in 1663. It burnt down twice, it was demolished once, but at Drury Lane some of the original theatre remains underground. There's a tunnel that they say leads from Drury Lane all the way to the Strand, not far from where we were at the Adelphi Theatre, where William Terrace was murdered. And they say that Nell Gwynn, who was an actress and orange seller, she did a few things to make money. King during the intermissions of the performances. And in those days, I can imagine the intermissions were very long as he wanted. Anyway, this is the Royal Opera House, or the back of. And these are some of the old carts from when Covent Garden Market relocated to Nine Elms in the late 60s, early 70s. Some lovely roses, some lovely hydrangeas, some lovely rhododendrons. Makes me long to be at the Chelsea Flower Show. If anyone has the BBC iPlayer, do look at the programmes, TV shows that are presented from there. It's very expensive to go to the Chelsea Flower Show. It's one of my dreams, but I've never been. And Drury Lane is in the distance, in the centre. Now, I worked at Drury Lane as a tour guide, on and off for many years, and front of house. I would rip tickets, I would sell ice creams, I did whatever I could. I became an actor 25 years ago, and at that same time, people often ask me, what was your first job when you graduated from drama school? And I say, well, my first job was selling ice creams at Drury Lane. And they say, no, your first acting job. And I say, well, my first acting job was at a small pub theatre called the Bread and Roses in Clapham, where I did a Harold Pinter play. And it was what they called a profit share play, where they say, well, whatever money we make, we'll share the profit. But actors always call those kind of shows loss share. You're sharing a loss, really. I would constantly hear stories when I worked at Drury Lane, though, from members of the public, from actors, from cleaners, from security, backstage crew, front of house. So many people claim to have experiences here. Some during the day, some at night, some in the middle of the night. The most famous ghost at Drury Lane is seen in the upper circle, the third level of the theatre, basically where the sign is, the lit up sign for Frozen the Musical. In 1840, a body was found up there, just off the side of the auditorium, bricked up in the wall. I say a body, it was a skeleton. Bricked up, the remains of a man, a grey tricorn hat, a three-cornered hat, a grey cloak, a dagger lodged in his ribcage. Not surprisingly, the man was dead. But the most sinister part of it was that that wall had remained. I know I said that the theatre had been there since 1663. The theatre had burnt down twice, been demolished once, but the wall just behind the sign for Frozen the Musical there had remained since 1663. This particular building is from 1812. They found a body bricked up in the wall with the fashion from the late 1600s, early 1700s. So it's possible that this man was murdered in the late 1600s, bricked up in the wall, and not found for nearly 200 years. He's supposed to be seen at the beginning of a play which has a long run. So it was seen a number of times during Miss Saigon, and that ran longest here from 89 to 99, 2,500 performances. It's been seen by cast members, audience, front of house. From the stage or the front of the auditorium, people have said that they've seen the man in grey at the same time. A lot of people think that ghosts really are only ghosts when a few people see them at once. And there's even a particular seat, D11 at Drury Lane. People have said they've walked past it and the seat has just fallen down. and as they walked past it, it's just popped up. So I remember those stories when I worked here. I also remember thinking it was a strange thing to find this body, and that they had never done any kind of infrared work on the walls, even though they had done so much restoration. The possible trash truck there. They found a crypt in there in the 1980s, and they bricked that up. The ghost of Joey Grimaldi, who was a clown in the late 1700s, he's been known to haunt Drury Lane as well. Being seen to tap people on the shoulder. People have felt themselves being kicked up the backside, which was one of his techniques on stage. They've looked round and there's no one there. An actor named Charles Macklin stabbed and killed another actor in the green room of the theatre, which was a room covered in green baize, like a pool or a snooker or a billiard table. Just off the side of the stage, it was soundproofed, the room. Macklin came off stage in the mid-1700s and he saw another actor wearing his wig. Stabbed him through the eye with a prop sword, which was a blunt instrument, basically a wooden stick. He went to court, he pleaded manslaughter. He only made one phrase in his defense. He said, "Who knows what a man may do in a passion?" And they let him off. He was branded with the letter M on his wrist for manslaughter. But they say he is still seen up there to this very day as well. We're just coming down to the Novello Theatre. Ivor Novello wrote a wonderful wartime song, "Keep the Home Fires Burning," and also starred in one of Alfred Hitchcock's early short, basically novella movies, a silent film named The Lodger. Other people say that that's their favourite film of Alfred Hitchcock's. This theatre is named after Ivor Novello. Showing Mamma Mia. Not really that scary, to be quite honest. With the Duchess Theatre here. Another theatre I've worked at, ripping tickets but never acted here. You might think, oh, that looks back to front. It's the play that goes wrong. So it's actually this way as the poster. Holds the record for the shortest run in theatre history, 1923, the Intimate Review. Didn't last a week, didn't last a month, didn't last a year, didn't even last one show. The Intimate Review in 1923 closed at the intermission of the first performance. It was overrunning by 2.5 hours at the intermission, and they said, pull the plug. And the producers the next morning said, we're closing the show. So the shortest run in the West End only did half a show. Here I am. Thank you so much, folks. Thank you for joining me. I know there may have been a bit of a dip in signal. Do apologise for that, but I hope you enjoyed what we did do. We're here on Drury Lane. Theatre Royal Drury Lane is actually not on Drury Lane, which is very strange. It did face this way for many years, and then they decided to face Covent Garden, because in the early 1800s, the then Bow Street runners, now known as the Metropolitan Police, along Drury Lane, raided 26 brothels in one weekend. So when the theatre was rebuilt in 1812, they decided to make it face Covent Garden to attract more people and a better kind of person. I'm pleased to say on this tour, we've got a better kind of person. Thank you so much Lovely to meet you, lovely to see you, and I will see you very, very soon